So this video is just going to be a compilation of all these sort of more personal TikToks I made. Timestamps are in the description, they all work standalone, so jump to whichever one takes your fancy, and I hope you enjoy. I took the hardest exam in the world. So Oxford University is made up of 45 different colleges. These colleges work a little bit like the houses in Hogwarts. So in order to study or teach at the university, you have to be a member of a college. Each of them are unique and wacky in their own way, but there's one in particular which is quite interesting. All Souls College. This college has no undergrads whatsoever. You can only apply to it if you already have an Oxford degree or you're currently studying a postgrad there. The college only lets in 1 to 2 members every year, and it selects these members through what's sometimes called the hardest exam in the world. And this examination's been running since 1878. All applicants have to sit 4 3-hour examinations, 2 specialist papers where you get to choose your subject, and 2 general papers which everyone has to sit. The subjects you can choose from for the specialist paper are classics, English literature, law, history, politics, philosophy, and economics. No sciences, only humanities. So when I was doing my masters in 2018, I thought, I'll have a go at this. Naturally, I picked philosophy. For all of the papers, you get a list of roughly 20 questions, and you get to pick 3 of them to write an essay on. And the questions are brilliant. Some of the questions that appeared in the philosophy paper which I did were things like, should we try to define art? Or do we have reasons to love those that we love? And some of the questions that appeared in my general paper were things like, can satire be constructive? Or what if there were no hypothetical questions, which I used to prove that aliens exist. And until 2010, you had to do a 5th exam, which was an essay written about a single word as a prompt. For example, water or courage. If you make it through this stage, you get to the Viva stage, which is kind of like a big interview about what you wrote. It lasts 25 minutes, and 50 of the fellows of the college have to attend. And from all that, they select 1 to 2 people every year. Now, why would someone put themselves through all of this to become a member of some weird college? Because if you're accepted, you're given 7 years of funding to research whatever you like, as well as accommodation in the college and other necessities. Basically, an academic dream of long-term financial stability. I, tragically, didn't make it to the 2nd stage of the exam. I guess they didn't like my arguments. However, on the All Souls College website, there are lots of past papers which detail all these really amazing, interesting questions which I would encourage you to read through. And that was the time.
Do we have reasons to love those we love? God, I hope not. The word love kind of sucks. I learned from Tim Kreider that the Greeks had a much better way of talking about it. They had different words to represent the very different kinds of love that exist. Words like eros, meaning sexual love, or philia, love for your friends, or storge, familial love. In English, we lump them all together under one big label, which just confuses things. But if you're like me, the kind of love you thought of when reading this question was romantic love. So let's talk about that. I'm always conflicted when I hear people giving long lists of reasons, often unprompted, as to why they love their partners so much. On the one hand, it's sweet to hear someone list off that their partner is funny, smart, caring, and so on. But on the other, it makes me a bit uneasy, because to me, these reasons explain why you might really like someone, but not love them. I've been in love 2 times in my life, and each time, if you had asked me whether I had any reason to love these people, I would have said, of course I do. In fact, I often attempted to express these reasons and feelings in various poems, letters, bits of art, and one particularly ill-fated attempt at a song. But in reality, everything I came up with, I invented after the fact. I didn't choose to be in love, I didn't reason my way into it, I didn't get any say in the matter. I imagine you didn't either. Why do we love who we love? Who knows? I once dated a scientist who was adamant that all love, compatibility, and relationships could be boiled down to things like genetics, timing, and upbringing. That we'll have the perfect science of love one day. This is about the most unromantic thing I can think of, but I know she's probably right. The fact remains that all the reasons that are likely to be involved are not ones we get to decide on. If you love someone who is totally compatible with you, I'm envious. But as far as I can tell, this is probably more of a happy coincidence than by design, evidenced simply by the sheer amount of heartbreak that exists in the world, and the fact that you can love the wrong person. Maybe love becomes more tempered with reason as you get older. I'm sure in the future I'll settle down and love someone who makes sense, someone who shares my values, life goals, and a work schedule that's not out of sync with mine. All practical things that should excite me, but currently do not. Perhaps by then I'll have my reasons. But the love I crave, and simultaneously fear, is that lightning strike love that doesn't come with any reasons. It's beyond it, where it feels like there are larger forces at play. Maybe, in its own way, it's kind of an unconditional love. It's irrational, not dependent on anything. It just sits there. A fact in the air, a new law of the universe. You're in love. A love which you don't have reasons for, but rather...
What if there were no hypothetical questions, and how would that mean that aliens exist? So the following is roughly what I argued in the exam. Bear in mind, I didn't get in. This was the last essay I did over the course of 12 hours of exams, and yeah. So here we go. There are 2 ways that we can understand the phrase hypothetical question. The first way is the common one, whereby we have an imagined situation which hasn't occurred yet, a hypothetical situation, and we put a question at the end of it. For example, hypothetically, if you won the lottery, how would you spend the money? Or hypothetically, if Hogwarts were real, which house do you think you would be sorted into? But there's a second way we can understand hypothetical question, and it's a little bit more nuanced. Hypothetically, there's an equation which describes everything in the universe, a theory of everything. We don't know if it exists, and we don't know what it is yet. So for the time being, it's hypothetical because it's currently not real. We haven't yet thought of it, it's not yet conceived. In the same way, perhaps there are hypothetical questions that we haven't thought of yet, and these questions would have certain properties. For instance, hypothetically, there's a question which, when asked, could reduce an entire nation to tears. Or, hypothetically, there's a question which could ruin an entire politician's career if asked. So these hypothetical questions are questions which could exist, which we haven't thought of yet. So our two types of hypothetical questions are situation which hasn't happened, followed by a known question, or question we haven't thought of yet. So what happens if there are no hypothetical questions? Well, in our first definition, it's only hypothetical because the situation hasn't happened. If you've actually won the lottery and I ask you, how are you going to spend your money? That's not a hypothetical question, that's an actual question. So if there are no hypothetical questions, then it means that you have won the lottery. And almost anything that we can imagine, anything that's logically possible, is real, because it's not hypothetical. So that's one definition. What about the second definition? If there are no hypothetical questions, then every question that could be thought of has been thought of. It's no longer hypothetical. It's been conceived. It's been asked. But there are an infinite amount of questions you can ask. This is easy to prove. There's an infinite amount of numbers. You can use numbers in questions. Therefore, there are an infinite amount of questions. So this should be outright impossible. You can't ask an infinite amount of questions in a finite amount of time and space. Our universe seems to be finite. Humanities certainly hasn't thought of an infinite amount of questions. So that means that if there are no hypothetical questions, some other life form would have had to have asked every possible question, an infinite amount of questions. They'd know a lot more than we do because they can do something we think is impossible. We can call that an alien. So in conclusion, if there are no hypothetical questions, that means that everything we can possibly imagine is real, or aliens exist. But I can imagine aliens existing, which means that regardless of your definition, if there are no hypothetical questions, aliens exist. If there's no sciences, then the All Souls exam is by definition in Division 2 of difficulty. I saw a lot of comments talking about how sciences are inherently harder than the humanities. Let me say this loud and clear. That is 100% incorrect. Let's remember that we're all on the same team here, right? All academia is in some way searching for knowledge, truth, answers, all that good stuff. Very broadly, we have two types of question. How does the world work, and how should we live in it? Look around you. In which of these areas do you think we're more deficient right now? You know you can describe any black hole with just 3 numbers? Mass, charge, and angular momentum. Try doing that for a human. Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, once said that he considered going into economics, the social science, the humanity, but said that the maths was too difficult. Theorizing about light was a lot easier than trying to understand human behavior. You know, it took less than 40 years after J.J. Thomson discovered the atom for us to split it. And soon after we had a nuclear bomb. But we've been trying to figure out how to get on with each other, how to understand each other, how to live, what to value, how to organize ourselves, since we've existed. And those problems are so difficult that we still haven't solved them. Most of the existential threats that face humanity aren't threats because we don't know enough science to fix them. They're threats because we'll fail to cooperate or will actively harm each other. I think most reasonable people would agree that it's easier to do okay in a humanities exam compared to a science or maths exam. However, it's much harder to do exceptionally well. I've never seen a literature, philosophy, classics, history paper with full marks. Whereas in maths and sciences, that happens all the time. Because it turns out that if you get maths, it's relatively straightforward to get every question correct. Humanities and non-humanities just have very different difficulty curves. And to a certain extent, that's down to our collective decision on how we examine those subjects. So yeah, often in humanities there aren't any right answers to the question, because we just don't know what they are yet. And if I had the power to make everyone wake up tomorrow and either perfectly understand the laws of the universe, or to perfectly understand themselves, each other, and how to cooperate, I'd pick this one every time, because it's a much harder problem. Morning pages. This is something that's really helped my mental health in the last couple of years, so I figured I'd talk about it. You've probably heard of it before, usually in the context of helping people become more creative. However, for me, I've just found it's been a really good therapeutic tool. Essentially, what you do is you get a book or, a notepad or whatever, and first thing in the morning is you write 3 pages continuously. You don't stop writing. That's key. The idea is that it basically works as a sort of brain splurge or brain drain. And I know, this sounds like, oh, it's obvious, right? Writing down my problems. How does that help? And I think I now know why. If you don't write it down or you don't talk to someone about it, it kind of just stays in your head of a sort of thought of this sucks or I'm unhappy about this or what have you. When you write down what's bothering you and you sort of just totally vent about it, it creates the space in your brain to go, well, what's next? Or what are we going to do about that? You allow yourself the mental space to move a little bit past where you were beforehand. And if you're progressing on your issues, then eventually you're going to come up with an idea to sort of solve them, or you're going to feel better about them. There's only so long you can write about something before realizing some deeper insight about it, or feeling a little bit better about it. At least that's been the case in my experience. So yeah, morning pages, help my mental health, would recommend trying it out. So I get the odd comment on my accent, which is a fairly standard West London British accent. And a lot of the time people say, oh, British accents sound very clever. But a couple of years ago I learned something about my accent which made me think it was actually quite silly. And that's all to do with how I pronounce this letter. Generally, English-speaking accents can be divided into two groups, rhotic and non-rhotic. Mine is non-rhotic, which means I pronounce this letter as R, whereas a rhotic accent might pronounce it as R. So I say car, whereas a rhotic accent might go car. Here, here, darling. Darling. Now, why should you care or care? Because it starts to matter in sentences like this. I caught the criminal and took him to court. I'm going to butcher this. I caught the criminal and took him to court. I poured the water over my cat's paw. I poured the water over my cat's paw. My natural accent doesn't distinguish between many different sounds or words, which is just quite silly. So, Margaret, darling, pour the water. Margaret, darling, pour the water. Oh yeah, it's book recommendation time. Here are some lesser-known books that I particularly like about the kinds of things I talk about on this page. The first one is Black Holes and Time Warps by a guy called Kip Thorne. This book's got it all. It talks about time travel, exotic matter, relativity, and the author, Kip Thorne, was a scientific consultant for the movie Interstellar, and actually wrote a book about the physics of that film as well. I haven't read that one, but yeah, he's a badass. This book's great. You should check it out. Quantum Theory, A Graphic Guide. I really rate this book. It's really succinct. It's got lots of sort of comics and images telling the story of like how quantum physics came to be. As you can tell, I kind of like graphic novels. It gives you really good context as to how quantum theory came about and how it works. So yeah, definitely check that out. Do you think what you think you think? The ultimate philosophical quiz book. Look, I love philosophy, but reading it is really dry a lot of the time. This is not one of those books. This book asks you questions, and it gives you lots of quizzes to fill out, and then it sort of tells you about the sort of consequences of your viewpoints and sort of shows you how it might be problematic. It talks about everything from ethics to God to identity. It's super accessible. It's just awesome. Definitely check it out. For people interested in maths, I would recommend Fermat's Last Theorem. So this book is about a guy called Pierre de Fermat, who was a brilliant mathematician and came up with this theorem, but didn't bother writing down the proof. And then he died. And then some of the greatest mathematicians for the next 358 years looked for a proof for it, and eventually found it using mathematics that didn't exist at the time Pierre de Fermat was alive. It's a really awesome story. It talks about a lot of interesting mathematics. It's super accessible again. Yeah, it's just a great, great maths book. And then finally, just in case you're new here, my favorite science book of all time is The Fabric of Reality, but I've done a video on that earlier on my page. So yeah, check any of these out. They're all great, and I'll talk more about some of my favorite non-science books another time.
Lazy, a Manifesto. Written by Tim Kreider. Read by me. You've probably had to listen to a lot of people tell you how busy they are. It's become the default response when you ask anyone how they're doing. Busy. So busy. Crazy busy. It is, pretty obviously, a boast disguised as a complaint. Notice, it isn't generally people pulling back-to-back shifts in the ICU or commuting by bus to 3 minimum wage jobs who tell you how busy they are. What those people are is not busy, but tired, exhausted, dead on their feet. No, it's almost people whose lamented busyness is purely self-imposed. They're busy because of their own ambition or drive or anxiety. Busyness serves as a kind of existential reassurance, a hedge against emptiness. Obviously, your life cannot possibly be silly or trivial or meaningless if you are so busy, completely booked, in demand every hour of the day. Yes, I know, we're all very busy. But what exactly is getting done? Are all those people running late for meetings and yelling on their cell phones stopping the spread of malaria, or developing feasible alternatives to fossil fuels, or making anything beautiful? I can't help but wonder whether all this histrionic exhaustion isn't a way of covering up the fact that most of what we do doesn't matter. I am not busy. I am the laziest, ambitious person I know. Like most writers, I feel like a reprobate who does not deserve to live on any day that I do not write. But I also feel that 4 or 5 hours is enough to earn my stay on the planet for one more day. And if you call me up and ask whether I won't maybe blow off work and check out the new American wing at the Met, or just drink chilled pink minty cocktails all day long, I will say, what time? Idleness is not just a vacation, an indulgence or a vice. It is as indispensable to the brain as vitamin D is to the body, and deprived of it we suffer a mental affliction as disfiguring as rickets. My own resolute idleness has mostly been a luxury rather than a virtue, but I did make a conscious decision, a long time ago, to choose time over money, and I've always understood that the best investment of my limited time on Earth was to spend it with the people I love. I suppose it's possible I'll lie on my deathbed regretting that I didn't work harder, write more, and say everything that I had to say, but I think what I'll really wish is that I could have one more beer with Chris, one more late night talk with Tash, one last good hard laugh with Boyd. Life is too short to be busy.
What does it take to get into Oxford or Cambridge? I now pretty regularly get some form of DM asking me about Oxbridge admissions, so here's a video about that. Who am I to talk about this? Well, I applied to Oxford for undergrad, didn't get in, took a gap year, applied to Cambridge to do natural sciences physics, got in, did my undergrad there, and then applied to Oxford again to do a master's and got in. So I've done 3 Oxbridge applications, which is more than any one person should do. Plus, during that time, I got to know a lot of academics who are involved in the admissions or interview process, and obviously I have a lot of friends who went through the same thing. So I feel like I have a reasonable exposure to this process. That being said, the following is just my opinion. Other people might disagree, I might be wrong. All the standard caveats, let's get into it. So in my opinion, to get into Oxbridge, you kind of need 3 things. Good grades, good interview skills, which we'll talk about in a minute, and luck. The simple fact of the matter is there are more people who can do the courses at Oxbridge than there are places. Many people I know, many of my friends who applied at various stages who are much smarter than me, didn't get in. The reason why some people get in and some people don't might be down to just the standard of people applying that year, performance on the day of the interview, or specialist entrance exams. Oxford and Cambridge know this, they know their system isn't perfect, it's just the best one they have so far. Let's remember that regardless of what you're applying to study for at these universities, whether it's physics, history, maths, whatever, the actual content of what you will learn will be the same pretty much anywhere else. The laws of physics aren't different or inherently more complex at Cambridge. The difficulty from these places comes from the fact that you get a large number of assignments during term time, you're competing against other really smart people in the exams, and terms are short, they're only 8 weeks long. So the way in which they teach you all this stuff in way less time is through tutorials or supervisions. These are one-on-one or 3-on-1 academic sessions with a professor or researcher whereby you go through questions and you talk about the subject. So here's the key. The interview isn't there just to test how much you know, it's there to see how much you can learn in this supervision or tutorial setting. So what they'll do in these sessions is they'll push you to the edge of your knowledge, wherever that may be, and see how far you can go in the dialogue with the teacher. A student who goes in knowing a lot but doesn't really respond well in that sort of setting is probably going to be looked at less favorably than a student who knows slightly less but learns a lot and really responds well. If you're accepted into the college, chances are the person interviewing you will actually be teaching you. So of course they're also thinking, do I relate to this person well? And obviously there are systems that exist where they say this person was really smart, we didn't click, but they'd really work well at a different college. My advice for preparing for these interviews, if you get offered one, look up and try answering problems outside of your exam curriculum and practice communicating your thinking process while you're working on a problem. If you sit in silence for 5 minutes and don't come up with the right answer, the examiner doesn't know if there's nothing going on in there, or you're super close and you just haven't said anything. So talk them through it, show them how your brain works. One last thing. I had a wonderful time at Oxbridge, it was great for me, but it's not perfect for everyone. It's very high pressured, and just because it's best on some ranking table doesn't mean it's best for you. If this was useful and you have more questions, let me know. Otherwise, if you're going to apply, best of luck.
One of the most useful lessons about creativity I've encountered is this concept called brain crack, which I learned from watching an episode of The Show with Zay Frank. Brain crack is what Zay Frank describes as being addicted to your good ideas. You get addicted to the drug-like good feeling that comes with thinking about your grand designs, which is preferable to facing the reality of, making the idea happen. When I first heard about this concept, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I realized it was describing me, and realizing this helped me to actually start making things in the first place. But pretty soon I ran into the opposite problem. Rather than being addicted to my perfect ideas, I realized most of my ideas were terrible. I felt like they were bad, uninspired, and most of the time not worth making in the first place. This feeling was exacerbated not only by the reality of making things, but also by the sheer volume of incredibly creative material that you can find online. And worse still, I found that if I sat around waiting to have a better idea, that better idea never came. All these bad ideas were like having 100 tabs on a browser just taking up processing space in my brain. Pretty soon I realized the solution. The only way to truly free up space and to get to those good ideas is to actually make the bad ones. We've all heard that cliche that you're the worst judge of your own ideas, which may or may not be true, but in some sense that doesn't matter, because good ideas can be just as paralyzing as bad ones. Either way, you've got to do the boring thing of getting over yourself. You can only work with what ideas and what tools you have at any given moment. Whether it's a good idea or bad idea, doesn't matter. All you can do is give it your best.
How to get less done in more time. Wait, what? Step 1. Take your phone with you everywhere. The key to being productive is the ability to tolerate boredom. We need to crush that capacity, and the best way to do this is to always have your phone at hand, your portable distraction device. Step 2. Constantly switch focus. Another key productivity skill is being able to focus for long periods of time. So when you are distracting yourself, make sure to do it haphazardly. Don't goof off watching long films or reading books for hours on end. That could build focus, and we don't want that. Switch from app to app and tab to tab. Step 3. Focus on time management rather than managing your energy and focus. Time management is important, but usually we don't get stuff done because we're just not in the right frame of mind. Step 4. Beat yourself up over not being productive enough. Waste more energy by punishing yourself for not being able to work all the time and living up to some ridiculous ideal that you saw on the internet. And step 5. Forget all of this, because awareness is the key to breaking this loop. And that's the hardest creative job in the world has to be being a manga artist for Weekly Shonen Jump. So you probably know manga as Japanese comics or graphic novels. You've probably seen volumes of them in bookstores, but what you probably don't know is the insane conditions in which a lot of manga is made. It's just unreal. Before they're published in volumes, manga chapters are typically published in monthly or weekly magazines. And the most popular of these is Weekly Shonen Jump. To give you a sense of how thick it is, this is the first Harry Potter book, and yeah. The reason why it's so thick is twofold. Firstly, in every weekly issue, there's a new chapter from the 20 or so ongoing different series that Weekly Shonen Jump is publishing at any given moment in time. And each one of those series typically has one person who is the primary author and artist for every single chapter. And secondly, each chapter is expected to be between 15 to 20 pages long. And this is published weekly, 48 weeks a year. So in order to achieve that sheer volume of output, these manga artists have to work monstrous schedules. Some have actually published their routines online. It's not uncommon for them to sleep 3 to 6 hours a night, working up to 18 hours a day for the bulk of their week. And here's the thing, most manga artists in Weekly Shonen Jump keep the schedule up almost entirely uninterrupted for years. Some have managed it for decades. The most popular manga in Shonen Jump right now, and indeed the entire world, is a pirate manga called One Piece. And it's been running since July of 1997. The author started it when he was 22 years old. He is 46 now and still continuing the same story. And the longest running series in Jump ever ran for 40 years. And if all of that wasn't crazy enough, the series in Weekly Shonen Jump are in a way competing with one another. Every week, Shonen Jump solicits feedback from its audience to assess how each series is doing, how popular it is, and it will rank them. And if your series is consistently not doing well, Shonen Jump will cancel it. So not only do you have to keep up with this relentless pressure, you also have to be better than the other world-class artists that are in the same competition as you. And all of this absurd pressure aside, we haven't even talked about the creative insanity that is this process. These authors can't spend weeks drafting ideas. Imagine trying to write a book whereby every week you'd have to submit 18 completely finalized pages linearly over the course of 6 months. How much harder would that be? And the most remarkable thing, despite all of this, is that some of the stories published weekly in this magazine are nothing short of masterful. Sure, they have assistants to do some background work and to help with inking and some character drawing, and they have an editor to sort of help them lay out the story, but ultimately these artists shoulder almost the entire creative burden of their particular series. I think it's obvious that the conditions in which this magazine sets up for its authors are not ideal, to say the least. Thankfully, the industry seems to be changing to accommodate for more breaks and more flexible schedules. But for me, knowing how these stories are made simply adds to the aura I experience while reading them. It's just incredible, and that's why completely agree there should be more respect for manga artists. Another story which is absolutely crazy to me is about the author of Naruto, Masashi Kishimoto. So Naruto was one of the greats. It ran for 15 years in Weekly Shonen Jump, from 1999 to 2014. Now Kishimoto actually got married in 2003, but he didn't have his honeymoon until after he was done with the entire series. He had it in 2015, 12 years later. Another story comes from the legendary Eiichiro Oda, who was the author of One Piece, which I discussed in the last video. Oda once told one of his editors that he expected him to die for One Piece. And apparently the editor initially laughed, thinking Oda was joking, but then Oda just went, no, I'm serious. This is why I can't take any of those hustle, entrepreneur, motivation style videos seriously. All these guys bragging about how hard they work, please. Chances are that as you're watching this video, the artists in Weekly Shonen Jump are drawing right now. They don't talk about optimizing morning routines, there's no self-congratulatory nonsense, none of that. They just silently produce chapter after chapter, week after week, and that is all the proof that you will ever need. If you're interested in the manga industry or in manga itself, I'd recommend checking out Bakuman, which is a manga about 2 young boys trying to become manga artists. And it talks all about the industry, and it's just a great story. And one of the key points it makes is that people who try to become manga artists know in advance how hard it is, which isn't to say that the industry shouldn't change to allow these artists to live healthier lives. But I think it's important to recognize, because these artists grew up knowing the difficulties of becoming a manga artist, knowing that it was going to be a really hard life, but aspired to do it anyway. And if that's not worthy of your respect, then I don't know what is.
The writing process. It is typically characterized by spending 93% of your time worrying about not writing, with only 7% on actual writing. Though it is said that some professionals and psychopaths are able to get actual writing time as high as 20%. We imagine that the writing process should feel good. It does not. It is true that, once in a blue moon, usually late at night, you will be struck with inspiration. At times like these, words will pour out of your hands in a frenzy, hours will vanish, and you will feel like a god. But the next day, when you reread what you wrote, these feelings will likely vanish. Instead, most of the time writing will feel more mundane, boring, like digging. Sometimes, after hours, you will end a session with only a few words, and they may not be good ones or even in the right order, but other times you will be more successful, and time again you will realize that the only thing worse than writing is not writing. That is, avoid the smart and therefore sad trap. For a long time throughout my teens, I bought into the misleading idea that intelligent people were somehow inherently, inescapably sad. Because I considered myself reasonably smart, I kind of just accepted my melancholy during those years, rationalizing it as a natural byproduct of seeing the world accurately, of not being naive. After all, ignorance is bliss, and I wasn't ignorant. But all this got destroyed one day when a friend of mine turned to me and asked, "If you're so smart, why aren't you winning? Why aren't you happy?" I had no good answer. I was forced to realize that, rather than being a byproduct of some supposed intelligence, my misery, and my acceptance of it, was just plain stupid. It's not as though this smart and therefore sad idea exists for no reason. We all know the trope of the tortured artist or the manic genius. Ernest Hemingway once said, "Happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know." It seems that being smart and informed is a high-injury sport. There's lots to be worried about in the world. And research does indeed show that anxiety, depression, and mental illness occur in higher rates with people who score higher on IQ tests. But this doesn't mean we should be fatalistic about it. Don't get me wrong, I think that true depression is a physical injury of the brain. I don't think you can think your way out of it any more than you can think your way out of a broken leg. But even if your leg is broken, there are things that you can do and not do to better facilitate recovery, or at least avoid further pain. You don't put weight on it deliberately. If I'm honest with myself, during my teens, there was a part of me that was secretly proud that I was sad. I thought it made me slightly better than people who were happy, in some weird, self-righteous way. Unknowingly, I had bought into another cliché, that while sadness and misery have depth and complexity, happiness is always a simple, unremarkable thing. This is incorrect. It can feel wrong to feel any happiness when you're even vaguely aware of everything going on in the world. But I think that true genius is looking at the world for what it is, all the good and bad parts, and still saying yes and finding a way to smile. I think it's in realizing that levity is not an ends but a means. It makes you lighter, you can go further, it's a fuel that burns with no pollution. Being smart and happy is not impossible. It's just another problem to solve, and you're going to figure it out. You just first need to accept that it can be done. So, the philosophy of Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Ferris Bueller embodies the idea of carpe diem. Seize the day, take back your life. What's unusual in this movie is that, as a main character, Ferris and his philosophy don't actually change throughout the film. He has no character arc. Instead, the secret main character of this film is Ferris's best friend, Cameron. Cameron represents the opposite viewpoint. He's afraid to seize anything. He is a stressed out, anxious, depressed, pessimistic, slightly nihilistic, unloved person. Cameron is me, and Cameron is you.
God damn it!
And Ferris has a simple solution: to push back and laugh. Sometimes to defeat fear, you've got to break the rules. You've got to subvert authority and get away with it, just so that you know you can. On their day off, they're chased relentlessly, but Ferris just laughs about it. And he can do this because he thinks,
Isms, in my opinion, are not good. A person should not believe in an ism. He should believe in himself.
and the way you get to that point is by daring to. What I also love about this film is how universally loved Ferris is. With the exception of a few characters, everyone adores Ferris, and we hear that he's helped out other people before. Ferris doesn't just seize the day for himself, he helps others do the same. Courage and joy are fires that spread. The film doesn't shy away from the fact that the next day, all three of them will be back in school, or that Ferris's carpe diem outlook needs to be tempered with a practical consideration for the future. Obviously, life needs a balance between the two, and this is a one-off. But sometimes, you've got to do the irresponsible thing, such that you can happily do the responsible thing. Our world is skewed to the side of Cameron, of doom and gloom and fear. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of good reasons for that. But the thing is, life is happening right now, all around us, in all its tragedy and glory. And we can only live today. And that is...
You are not your opinions, and that is a good thing. One thing I really love about science is that updating and changing your beliefs about the world is an accepted part of the process. We don't look back at scientists from the past and think that they were bad scientists because they don't share the same beliefs about the world that we do, because they were only doing what they could with the knowledge they had at the time. And to an extent, that's kind of what we're all doing with everything. Although, it should be said that there's a great deal of research which shows that our beliefs that we hold about the world aren't as rationally justified as we might like to think. They're hugely influenced by what groups we identify with, our upbringing, our culture, that sort of thing. But I like that in principle. Rather than identifying with a set of ideas, a scientist is someone who identifies with the process of updating them and making them more accurate. And I think this is a really helpful attitude to bring to other areas of life. Because if you have this attitude, then being wrong about something isn't a bad thing. It just means that you learned something which you didn't know before and adjusted your beliefs accordingly, which is logical. Now, obviously, in a perfect world, we wouldn't hold opinions about anything until we knew everything there was to know about that thing. But aside from the fact that knowing everything about anything just being impossible, daily life is going to force us to make decisions and hold opinions about things which we're not experts on. One of the reasons why I generally try avoid labeling myself with an ism, be it philosophical or political or whatever you like, is because I don't want my sense of self to be attached to a set of ideas, because that's just going to cloud my judgment. I want to be free to change my opinions as I learn more things. I heard this analogy from CGP Grey once about thinking of yourself like a computer and the opinions you hold like the programs or software that's installed in it. Obviously you update, remove and install programs all the time, and that's just natural. And another thought I try and bear in mind is the idea of strong opinions loosely held. Strong opinions are really good for engaging in lively debate and testing ideas, but if you find out you're wrong, drop them, hold them loosely, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, and maybe I'm just naive in this, I think we all deep down share the same values. We all want to be happy, healthy, and for our loved ones to live safe and good lives. We're all pretty much on the same team. We just disagree about how best to get there. But how best to get there is a thing that we can work out, and there will be objectively better ways and worse ways, and that should be testable, and something that we can all agree on. And even those who have actively hateful views, who clearly don't seem to be on the same team, were taught that. No one was born into this world hating a particular group of people. That was something that was learned, and perhaps it can be unlearned. Because how I became more articulate, and how you can do the same. I owe most of whatever dubious speaking ability I have to a guy named Leo. So growing up, I developed an interest in debating, and I was quite lucky because my school had a debating club. To put a long story short, when I was in year 9, me and a couple of other students from my year, and some from a couple of years above me, were taken under the wing of a sixth former from our school, and that was Leo. He basically took us to one side after debating club and said, "Hey, you guys are good, but I can make you better. I'm forming an unofficial debating society. Would you like to join?" So every Monday after school for about 2 years, this guy would get us debating against each other. And he trained us. There were about 10 people in this little club of ours, and most of the debaters in it were in years above me. When we debated, we were only given the topic we were going to speak about 15 minutes before the debate started, and we would have to speak for 5 minutes. This is all pretty standard in competitive debating. And we also didn't get to pick which side we would argue for, so very often you would argue against the view that you actually held yourself, which is a really good and healthy thing to do. We did all these bizarre training exercises, like a game called Defending the Indefensible. Everyone in a room writes down on a piece of paper a bunch of ideas they think that you could never really defend, like making cheese illegal, or suggesting that we should immediately declare war on every country on the planet, or whatever. We would tear these pieces of paper up, fold them and put them in a hat, rustle them around, and pass the hat around, and you pick one out at random, read it, and immediately have to start defending that. You'd have to just speak and go. And through that you learn to talk and think on the fly, and it's a really useful skill. Partially because I was in the younger cohort, I was destroyed in these debates constantly, but it forced me to learn. Leo himself was a really great debater, as were many of the others, and because they were all better than me, I learned by really just copying them. Their cadence, their rhythm, their tone, their emphasis, and I never really stopped doing this, and this is where the advice comes in. Even to this day, I will watch clips of people I find articulate or eloquent, and I will actively try to mimic them. So my advice would be to do the same. Find a speaker who speaks in a way that you resonate with, who you naturally listen to and think, yeah, I would like to speak like this. And literally practice reading out their words from a transcript in their style. This might sound like a weird overkill thing to do, until you remember that we learn music from playing other people's songs. We learn to cook from following other people's recipes. We're all just DJs here. We're not trying to invent new words. We're not trying to invent new instruments. We're just remixing everything. And by giving yourself a lot of samples to work with, you'll naturally make something original. And my second piece of advice is engage with debates with friends and with people who hold different opinions from you. Play around with arguing for sides different to the one that you actually hold. This will stretch your thinking and will actually make you more persuasive. Croggy named Block asks, Jack, I have a question. As someone who wants to broaden my understanding of everything at a relatively young age, how should I go about this? That's a big question, and something I'm working on myself. So here are my thoughts so far. Firstly, as far as possible, look after your brain and body. You are in this for the long haul, there is a lot to learn, so you want to maximize your time and maximize the quality of that time as well. Even more importantly, learn how they work and how to use them. A great free resource on this I've been enjoying recently has been the Huberman Lab podcast. It talks about practically applied neuroscience, how to improve memory, sleep, focus, all that good stuff. There's tons of other stuff out there as well. Books, TED Talks. Use the information to create good habits early on, they will pay off. Secondly, I think a useful distinction to make early on is between knowledge and understanding. By knowledge, I mean facts, information, how many legs a spider has, what the name of a certain plant is, how big the sun is. These are your data points and your labels. By understanding, I mean explanations, theories, predictions. These can be scientific, economic, political, psychological. They're the grand narratives, they're the line of best fit through your data. Now, I should say, this is an oversimplification. The two do influence each other. All knowledge is theory-laden. There's definitely overlap sometimes, and not everything fits into these two categories. However, the point is, don't neglect either of these. Some people know a lot, they have a lot of facts and information, but they haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what they know or stitching it together to create any meaningful insight, which is kind of a shame. And on the other extreme, sometimes you get people who know a lot of theories and just think all day and pontificate, but they don't have any information that really grounds it in reality. Some philosophers are guilty of this. These are the sorts of people who think, oh, why should I bother learning facts when I can just look them up? Or why should I bother learning mental maths when I have a calculator? In my opinion, this is a mistake. Having things embedded in your memory allows you to make connections that you wouldn't have otherwise made. So, you need both. Don't neglect either. 3, follow your curiosity. You will naturally digest and remember information that you care about. It is the most efficient way to learn anything. So start with what you're interested in and spiral outwards from there. And point 4, stay humble. The hard part about learning is that the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. The surface area of your ignorance is always expanding. That horizon of enlightenment is always something you'll chase. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes this well. You've probably heard of it. It's a hypothetical cognitive bias whereby people with limited knowledge will greatly overestimate how much they actually know about a subject and so will be really overconfident. And you only become confident again after you spend a long time being uncertain. I think there's a deep element of truth to this. So if you've never experienced any doubt, I would say that's probably a red flag. Be prepared to be wrong quite a lot and be prepared to change your mind as you learn. When it comes to understanding everything, I'm nowhere near the other side of this curve. If you ever reach it, please do let me know. A book that kind of helped me grow up is one which I disagree with large parts of, but I still think was important for me to read. And that book is The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. I first read this when I was about 13, 14 years old maybe. If you haven't heard of it, it basically presents 48 rules or laws on how to gain social status and power, with absolutely no regards to morality whatsoever. This is basically how to be a sociopath 101. Now, I do not think this is a good book to base your life on. I didn't when I first read it, and I certainly don't think so now. However, some people do, and to a young teenage me, I think that was a really important thing to realize, that some people are just power hungry, that sociopaths exist, and this is literally how they think. This book gave me a framework for understanding those things. It got me thinking in terms of power. I remember an immense calm that came over me when reading certain parts of the preface, which still has my notes from back then. Power's crucial foundation is the ability to master your emotions. An emotional response to a situation is the single greatest barrier to power. Emotions cloud reason, and if you cannot see the situation clearly, you cannot prepare for it and respond to it with any degree of control. This particular bit of advice I found genuinely empowering. The idea that emotional control was a form of strength. It helped me deal with bullies and confrontation and just generally helped me keep a cool head in stressful situations. And I think ironically it made me kinder in the long term because it forces you to consider how other people are thinking and where they're coming from, and so it allows you to make a more compassionate choice because you realize that a lot of situations and anger generally aren't about you as to about things outside of your control. The book goes on to say that you cannot repress anger or love, or avoid feeling them, and you should not try. Which I think is good advice. But then it does start to go downhill by saying, and most important, they should never influence your plans and strategies in any way. There is a lot of questionable advice in this book. For instance, it advises that you should be actively deceptive, never trust anyone, and not waste your time worrying about the problems of other people, to name but a few. There are many. Thankfully, I ignored that stuff. So yeah, it's a very mixed bag, full of some great and terrible insights and advice. I'm kind of glad it exists, because it gives you a very cynical view of the world, which you can then outgrow, as you realize that there are more important things than power, and that, ironically, worrying about power all the time is the least powerful thing you can do.
Saying, I love you. When I was younger, I promised myself the following. If I ever said, I love you to anyone, in any context, friend, family, all the flavors of love, I would mean it. Fully. To my naive younger self, I love you seemed to be sacred words. They carried weight. In my family, we say it often to each other, so it was never something that felt embarrassing in that context. But the first time I said it to a romantic partner was another thing entirely. I was 19 and I had known her for 3 months. She was my first serious girlfriend. My first many things. We were lying on the floor of my room, talking and laughing, when suddenly I became aware of a sensation in my chest. It felt as if my lungs were continuously inflating with air, threatening to burst unless I spoke. So, fulfilling precisely no one's teenage dream, I paused, locked eyes, and uttered the following. I think I'm in love with you. She, to my great relief, replied without hesitation, I think I'm in love with you too. We were both right. As with most relationships, it eventually came to an end, though for the right reasons. The second time I was romantically in love with someone, years later, and wiser by experience, I was about 2% smoother with the declaration. We were curled on her bed spooning. Me, the larger spoon. It was about 10 in the morning, and I had about 20 minutes before I had to leave to get a train back home. Now, I had known I was in love with this person since about the first time we kissed, but somehow, until then, I had just about kept my cool. But in that moment, it was just too much for me. I found myself saying, hey, sorry to say this, but go on, she said, in a playful, patronizing voice, which she had surely spent thousands of hours practicing. I kind of love you. She, to my great relief, replied without hesitation, I kind of love you too. We would tell each other often. I don't quite know when she stopped meaning it. As time went on, she did some things that weren't so great, and that hurt. All the while telling me that she loved me, she kept saying it, and I kept believing it. Waking up in the night in cold sweats more than a year after it was all over, I felt like such a fool. All this to say, this reinforced my view that the words I love you have to be meaningful for someone to use them. Misusing them can range from mischievous to poisonous. I'm not really sure what I want to do with my life before I die, but something I've decided to do, which seems relatively achievable, is to make sure that everyone I love knows that I love them. In the last few years, I've endeavored to do this more widely, particularly with my friends that I love, who I hadn't told before. I told Addy I loved him after we'd had a long heart-to-heart. It felt like it had always been in the air, and just we hadn't mentioned it. I told Tash as we sat in my car by Hammersmith Station, right before she went home on a rainy night. And I told Chris on the phone, after racing on foot across a 6-lane highway rather than taking the underpass, because it was an important conversation, and it was not the time for signal to be cut. And every time I've done this, the ground beneath my feet has become a little bit firmer. There's a bit more air in my lungs. There's another shade of color I can see. It's made my life better.
What's the one book everyone should read? Oftentimes I see internet articles recommending some sort of productivity book or whatever, and that's fine. But my own personal answer to this question is The Choice by Edith Eger. Edith Eger is a survivor of Auschwitz. She was sent there when she was 16 years old. This book is about her story not only of surviving the camps, but also about the life that she built afterwards. She's just the most extraordinary person. She went on to study psychology in her 40s, became a therapist that specialized in PTSD, and she wrote this book in her late 80s. She's in her 90s now and has published another one. Every single person I've recommended this book to has gotten so much out of it. It's so deeply layered with wisdom, empathy, and it's just an incredible story. Let me just read this bit to you. It's from the introduction on page 10. I also want to say that there is no hierarchy of suffering. There's nothing that makes my pain worse or better than yours. No graph on which we can plot the relative importance of one sorrow versus another. People say to me, things in my life are pretty hard right now, but I have no right to complain. It's not Auschwitz. This kind of comparison can lead us to minimize or diminish our own suffering. I don't want you to hear my story and say, my own suffering is less significant. I want you to hear my story and say, if she can do it, then so can I. Which, coming from someone who's been through that, is just extraordinary. And then she gives this example. One morning I saw 2 patients back to back, both mothers in their 40s. The first woman had a daughter who was dying of haemophilia. She spent most of her visit crying, asking how God could take her child's life. I hurt so much for this woman. She was absolutely devoted to her daughter's care and devastated by her impending loss. She was angry, she was grieving, and she wasn't at all sure that she could survive the hurt. My next patient had just come from the country club, not the hospital. She too spent much of the hour crying. She was upset because her new Cadillac had just been delivered and it was the wrong shade of yellow. So, if you're like me, I'm expecting now Edith Eger to say, person who's crying over the Cadillac has a lack of perspective, and that needs to be sorted out. But this is what she says. On the surface, her problems seem petty, especially compared to my previous patient's anguish over her dying child. But I knew enough about her to understand that her tears of disappointment over the colour of her car were really tears of disappointment over the bigger things in her life that hadn't worked out the way she had hoped. A lonely marriage, a son who had been kicked out of yet another school, the aspirations for a career she had abandoned in order to become more available for her husband and child. Often, the little upsets in our lives are emblematic of the larger losses. The seemingly insignificant worries are representative of greater pain. read it. There's a quote from Heisenberg which says that the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. I'm not sure I've quite reached the bottom of the glass yet. When I first got into science and philosophy as a teenager, along with reading books like The God Delusion and what have you, I wore my atheism proudly, as if it proved that I was intelligent. I mean, I thought, who could believe in God? It's got so many contradictions, different religious traditions say different things. I would say things like, I'd rather jump out of a plane with a parachute rather than a prayer, as if that made me intelligent and insightful. And then as I got older, I realized a couple of things. Firstly, that a lot of scientists, especially physicists I looked up to, were sometimes deeply spiritual or religious people. And secondly, that the universe is a barren, hostile place. Like there's not an atom of meaning anywhere to be found, and I found myself drifting towards nihilism. I'm not sure if God exists, or what they'd be like if they did, and I'm certainly not religious, but I have learned that, at least for me, I need to have a certain level of non-rationality to go with all the rationality. So far in my life, that's just been cultivating a faith that eventually everything's going to be alright. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. I came across this idea in a really dark period of my life. I wanted an outlook on the world which was stress-tested, which wasn't going to break on me in hard times. I looked at philosophies like Taoism, Buddhism, and Stoicism, and I found them all useful. But what really clicked for me in the end was reading personal accounts of people who had survived atrocities, people who had survived war, or decades of wrongful imprisonment, or the Holocaust. An account that really stood out to me was James Stockdale, who was a POW in Vietnam for over 7 years. In an interview, he said, "You must never confuse the faith that you will prevail in the end with the discipline to confront the brutal facts of your reality." He said that the POWs that didn't survive were the optimists, the ones that said, "Oh, we'll be out by Christmas," or "we'll be out by Easter." They were constantly disappointed, ended up heartbroken, and couldn't go on. Jim Collins called this view the Stockdale paradox. You must always be absolutely realistic about how the world is, but also cling to the faith that things will be alright. Believing that things are going to be alright eventually is not me describing the world. It's a means for me to live in it. Question. Here's my story. For A-level, as well as physics and maths and stuff, I did something called an EPQ, which let me do a dissertation on anything I liked. I did mine on, is human time travel possible? That's how I got into this stuff. So I applied to Oxford to do a degree in physics and philosophy, and during that entrance exam, I had an anxiety attack. And I ended up scoring 1 point below the cutoff for interview, so I didn't get in. Took a year out, finished my A-levels, ended up applying to Cambridge to do natural sciences physics, got in, had a wonderful time there, and following that I applied to Oxford again to do a master's in the philosophy of physics. This time they accepted me. That was so great that I applied to their PhD program to do a PhD in multiverse theory. They accepted me, but by that stage my life had kind of fallen apart. I was really depressed, and I had developed an eating disorder, so it didn't really feel like something I could complete. So since then, the last few years, I've just been working normal corporate jobs, trying to get my health and life back together. So I'm not a doctor or a professor. At this point in time, I am a mildly educated enthusiast.